Nathanosaurus Rex here, back once again to talk about Dungeons and Dragons and all things tabletop roleplay related. So, there's actually a lot of games out there, not just D&D. I know, hard to believe, but there are thousands of the damn things. I love a lot of them, and what a lot of them come down to is setting. There are a lot of different games with a lot of different settings, and for Dungeons and Dragons, there are a myriad of different settings published that you can play your games within. Sometimes you want to do something a little bit different. Sometimes you want to either modify or carve out your own kind of space within one of these settings, or create a setting entirely of your own to run one of these games within. And that brings us into what I want to talk to you about today, which is world building. It's a pretty big topic, so today I'm going to cover kind of the broad strokes, the sort of top end beginnings of it, and I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some other elements of it in some future videos as well. So, what do we mean when we say world building? Well, to me, it means creating a setting, creating a framework within which to tell our stories. Tabletop role playing is all about collaborative storytelling, and this is where we begin thinking about where we're going to set our stories, what the world that those adventures are going to take place in is, what it's like, what it's all about, and how it works. Now, it can seem like a pretty daunting thing at first, and I think any DM that's kind of thought about creating their own world, creating their own setting to run their own campaign in, there are really three things which are going to be your big concerns when you're doing this. I'm sure we've all thought this, creating an entire world seems like a huge endeavor. Where do you even start? Where to start? It seems like a hell of a lot of work. I mean, creating an entire world, how much of that, how much work is it going to be? How much of that work do I need to do before I can begin my game? Nobody wants to spend years creating a great setting and never actually getting around to playing. And three, once you've found your beginning, once you've spent all that time creating a world to play in, are your players going to be interested? Is it going to be as interesting and fun for your player group as you'd hope it would be? Are they going to want to go adventuring in it? As that's what it's all about at the end of the day. And the most important thing, I believe, this is the way I tend to do it. The most important thing for all of this is player involvement, and that will go a big way. It won't solve all your issues, but that will give you your biggest sort of chunk of answer to those three questions. If you involve your players when you start building your world, you'll get a much better idea of where to begin. If you involve your players in collaborating with you to create that world, it will share that work out. If you can get them to do a little bit of that world creation with you or for you, then that's going to save you a good chunk of work. And if they're involved in all of those things, then you're already 90% of the way to making sure that you've got a world that is interesting and engaging to your player group right off the bat. So, with all of that said, there are some of the things that we need to think about. So, where do you begin? Well, where I begin when I'm thinking up a world to play my game in is theme and style, which are kind of really the same sort of thing. So, what type of stories, what style of story is it that you want to tell? You are going to have to think very differently about the kind of world that you want to make. If you want to tell tales of high fantasy adventure, or tales of dark, grim, and realistic, perilous horror, you're going to end up with a very different world if though one of those is going to be your main focus. Now, it's possible to tell all kinds of different stories within the same setting sometimes, but if you really want to focus on one particular genre, one particular style of storytelling, then that needs to inform both the type of world that you create and perhaps even the system that you're going to play that within. For example, if you want to play a really low fantasy, hardly any magic, combat can be quite dangerous and deadly, and injury and healing are quite difficult and arduous, then I would suggest 5th Ed D&D is probably not the best fit for that style of game. You know, you may want to look at something like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, or if you maybe want that style with a horror theme, maybe something like Call of Cthulhu. But coming back to sort of creating a world around one of these systems within which to play your type and theme of story is definitely something where we want to be coming to this idea of player involvement. Think about the stories that you want to tell, talk to your players and communicate with them, and find out what kind of stories they want to tell. You might be giving them a world to play within, you might be setting the stories and creating the quests that they're going to be going on, but it is their character's story which is going to be the meat and bones of your adventures and your time together. So talk to them about the kind of stories and styles that they're interested in. If they're interested in high fantasy, then, and you're interested in low fantasy, then you need to find some kind of common ground in the middle. You need to find something that's going to work for all of you and be engaging for all of you. So once you've figured out what kind of theme you want your world to have, what kind of style, be it horror, science fiction, high fantasy, low fantasy, teen melodrama, whatever it might be, you can start to build an idea of the type of world that you're going to create. So that brings us to your starting point. And where do you begin with something as big as creating an entire world? Well, what's important? You need to start with the most important thing for your world, for your setting, and have that influenced by your theme. If your theme is high fantasy, where the gods have a big investment in the world and are interfering in the lives of day-to-day mortals and allocating them as champions, then maybe the first thing you want to start with your world building is your deities and your pantheon. Perhaps that is going to be your first and most important set of creations. If you're playing or creating a futuristic cyberpunk setting of dark future dystopia where the big corporations run everything and it's their machinations that are going to be the focus and the theme of that game, then perhaps the first thing you want to create is your biggest and most important corporation that's running the show. So think about both those things that fit the style of storytelling that you're going to be undertaking, the theme of your campaign world, and what is important to that, what's going to drive that story forward and give you that sort of meat to really sort of get into. Now, it's important not to focus too entirely on one central theme. It's important to have a strong central theme, but if you have a world where there is only one big corporation that run literally everything, that doesn't leave a lot of scope for stories within that, with things sort of breaking off to the sides of that, side story, side characters, tension, and so on. If the gods do everything for mortal humans and elves and dwarves within your world, then they're able to do whatever they need to do. Do they really have need of mortal champions? Do the players then have anything to do? So while it's important to have a strong theme and create those first initial most important elements first, don't forget to also flesh out some of the wider things around that to make a less one-dimensional world for your players to interact with. And again, when we're coming to these ideas, keep your players involved, and that will save you a lot of work. So how much of this do you need to do? How much do you need to create? Well, we've started with our biggest, most important elements first, and then we're broadening out from there and starting to fill in a few of the gaps. Now, the two things I like to remember for this are, one, again, player involvement. I can't stress it enough. Talk to your players. If they have an idea that's really cool for something that tessellates into this, especially something that might be relevant to an idea they've had for their character, then wherever possible, run with it. Don't expect them to do all of the legwork. Don't let them do all of the creation. You still need to have a hand in shaping as much of this as you can and you like. So, but by keeping them involved, you are going to lessen your work. If they have an idea for the patron god that's going to be intrinsic to their character, let them write that. Keep involved with it, and you may need to tweak or amend things, or say to them, no to this part of the idea, but yes to this, and make sure you're still keeping a degree of ownership of the creative process, but involve them, and you will be able to have a much more manageable amount of workload by allowing your players to take some of that weight on, and that will also make them very, very invested in the world and the story that you're building together. Secondly, on the subject of how much to do, enough and no more. And that may not sound like the most helpful advice, but the way I like to do it is I create those big beginning parts, the most important elements of the world, and then expand out from that with ideas. And I don't want to have the full history of where the ore was smelted for every nail in every building in every conceivable region of my world, as that takes too long and you will never get as far as playing your game. Equally, you don't want to be caught on the back foot. If you've established that the gods are super important in this world, and there's 12 of them, and they each have a different religion, and your player has a particular patron, and they turn around to you in the middle of a game session and says, right, I need to invoke the name of, or go and send a message to the head priest of this god's religion, and you have no idea sort of where their temple is, who that person is, what their sort of religious order is going to be about, then you're in a little bit of trouble. So you need to have enough of an idea of roughly how things are going to work that you can flesh those out as you go and improvise extra little bits into that without leaving yourself short of sort of broader ideas that you need to fill your story in with. So when we're talking about creating a world, we're also often talking about creating the sort of rules of that world. I'm not talking necessarily about the actual game system, although elements of your world can inform parts of that. Perhaps, as in my D&D setting, the High Elves are no longer a playable race, as in the history of my world they were wiped out 300 years ago by a great war that fractured the world as it was, and meant that there's now less sort of access to magical items and artifacts than perhaps there were when the High Elves were still around. So it can affect the parts of the system, and that's something you need to think about. But when I say the sort of rules, I mean kind of the internal logic of your game, and it's important to have consistency, as consistency in a fantasy world or a sci-fi world is believability. Believability might seem like a bit of a daft concept when we're talking about mages throwing fireballs or high-tech spaceships that can travel thousands of light years in the blink of an eye. But in science fiction and fantasy, we can suspend our disbelief that magic or future technology or alien abilities or psychic powers might make a lot of things which are fantastical possible, and even potentially common and day to day. But once we have those elements in the world, once we have the rules around those, we need to stay consistent to them. It's that own, as long as you're true to your own internal logic, it will remain believable. I mean, we've all had that moment, sort of 7 seasons into an anime, when it's clear that the fifth change of writing team and have completely lost sight of what the original premise was and have just done something very casually, which, if you think about sort of how everything was laid out in episode 1, makes absolutely no sense. We don't want that for our stories. So if you've set out a central to your premise, say, again, your world is a highly magical world where the gods have daily impact on people's lives. Everybody within that world, you've decided, is touched by the mark of a particular god, and your players have come up with some of those gods, and they are their divine champions who are granted magic only through the actions of those gods. If you have somebody who is not affiliated with any of them suddenly start throwing lightning bolts around, then that's going to raise some questions. If you've got things which don't fit with that, say you have the only way to travel between great distances between the stars is through a proprietary wormhole technology which has been lost to the eons and only exists in certain gates in certain systems. If you suddenly have a vessel pop in that's able to zap from place A to place B across the solar system, across the galaxy, without using those, then your players are going to start to lose that ability to suspend their disbelief, as it doesn't fit with the logic of your game world. If you are going to deviate from the logic and rules that you've laid out in this initial idea of your setting, then your exceptions need to be exceptional. If you've determined that the only source of magic is ancient draconic bloodlines that distort their recipients with scaled faces and strange reptilian eyes, and that's the only way you can get sorcery, and you suddenly have somebody who doesn't display any of those traits throwing fireballs, or you have in your setting with your epic god-marked individuals with their given their powers from divinity, and you have somebody displaying those powers who has no contact with any of the gods at all and denounces them as false, then there needs to be a very good reason for those things. These should be moments where your players are sitting up and taking notes and going, hang on a minute, what's changed here? Why is that happening? And it needs to be central to your story. If it's just because you've gaffed and completely forgotten how your setting works, then that's going to strain the bounds of the believability. So Again, it's a big topic, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this in some future videos, but start with what's most important to your setting, dictated by the style of story and the theme of story that you want to tell, and start by talking to your players about that. Continue with making it manageable by creating the broad strokes and most important elements of your world first, and then fleshing out gradually from there. And you can do that fleshing out as you play, as you discover more of the world. You can bring those additional elements in and let your players have a hand in that, as it will both reduce your workload significantly and, most importantly, make your players invested in the world that you are creating together. You're not just saying, well, you're not just saying, well, here's my ball, you can play with it a little bit, we can, this is something I've created, you can come and get involved with a little snippet of it. You're creating that world together. It's something that belongs to all of you, and you're all going to be equally invested and excited for the stories that are going to come out of it. I've been Nathanosaurus Rex. I'll be back with some more ramblings about the vagaries of creating your own worlds and settings in some future videos. Thank you.